And that's why I say, let's look at the way we're programming our children and see how those qualities come out. Because I think we know clearly enough now how to look after a child in those early years to get those qualities out, to at least have the capacity for those qualities.
So the problem then, if I understand you, is that we end up producing the patients that you're caring for in an environment when they're kids that lacks those qualities, or that lacks their learning those qualities?
Well, I think there's two things. I think our children are treated in those important years, many of them are treated exceedingly indifferently. They are not cared for in an empathic, affectionate way. They're not treated with honesty, and they're not treated as equal people, tiny people, but equal people. Those are not the ways we, by and large, think of our children. And we don't rearrange the priorities of our lives to see that those children have those experiences, that their emotional needs are looked after. So then I think later on we get out of that, the neglect of those qualities. We get kids who have a relative inability to experience trust, affection, and empathy. And the extreme forms of that, I mean the kids who really get it in spades, who are consciously or unconsciously rejected by their parents or parked here and there and everywhere during those critical years, out of them come the kids who end up in Oak Ridge, the severe psychopaths who can kill with impunity.
You've talked about, I think you said 18 to 36 months, you've talked about the very young. Is that age the significant age?
Well, I think it is. It sounds extreme, you know, you say it's all over. Look after the child during pregnancy, be very careful during the birth, and the first 3 years. And someone says, well, you know, doesn't it matter after at 3.5? Well, obviously there's no sharp cutoff point. What seems clear is that from a common sense point of view, early experience is more important than later experience. If you detect breast cancer early, you have a better chance of, well, that's just sort of a logical point of view. But the other thing is, if you could say to me, you can have a child, but you can only have an exposure to that child for a 3-year period, you know, which 3 years would you pick? Well, I think clearly you'd pick the first 3 years, not because all and everything is done then, but it's like building the foundation of a building.
Well, what kinds of things are done during those first 3 years? What is it that we as parents, that our children, when they become parents, can do that makes the difference?
Well, what happens during those first 3 years is that the foundations of a capacity for empathy, a capacity for trust, and a capacity for affection are laid down. That's what happens. That's what we want to have happen. And how that comes about is that the child's emotional needs are met at that time. That means when the child is crying, you don't park it in the next room for 3 days, and then after that it quits crying. You know, this preoccupation with spoiling the child. If you pick it up and hug the 1-year-old, you're liable to have a suck when he grows up. I mean, these rather barbaric notions that I think all are kind of rationalizations for not letting the infant's needs supersede our own priorities. I think we have to alter that and say, are we attending to those infants' emotional needs? Are we treating the child empathically? Are we trying to get inside the infant's heads and see the world the way he sees it, which has to come from a knowledge of psychology, because the child is not just a shrunk-down adult and doesn't have, for example, a time perception that adults do. But are we trying to meet those needs, or are we trying to make it out to the next meeting on time?
I was just going to ask you that. Doesn't the need to meet those needs sometimes come into conflict with some of the other things that are,
it certainly
at
did.
the child rearing age, awfully important? Isn't there a conflict in the young years of parenthood between career and marriage and friends outside the family, and does something have to go? Does something have to be given up in order to accomplish what you're suggesting?
Well, there certainly was a conflict in my life. I was in high gear, the head of a very well-known treatment program, and people were coming from other countries, and I was just doing everything. And we had my daughter in 1969, and there was my wife at home, like most of us, the wives carrying the brunt of it. And I would come home exhausted and flop in bed and want the child not crying and want some supper. It isn't worth it. that's the way I did it. I think that's the way everybody's doing it. I think by the time they get to be my age, or by the time they look at the issues, they say, oh my. And then they're very often say, well, perhaps it isn't all that important then back, as a rationalization, I think. I think it is important. And I think it was important in my own daughter's life, and I think I wasn't there.
What's to be done then, Elliot? Are there changes, profound changes that have to be made? If there is this conflict, and you're saying that that's where we have to be, and that the parenting process is so critically important, what do we do? Do we have to reorder society? Can this fit into our existing value structures?
Well, there are a number of values in our society that really do run counter to giving parenting a high priority. I think we're all wired to an excess of consumerism and materialism that doesn't necessarily have to get in the way, but usually does. We come to believe that we have to have a certain standard of living in order to be happy. And we don't make arrangements for our children in keeping with the infant's needs. We do so that we can maintain our standard of living. We have mortgage payments, we have car payments, and these are important in order for me to be happy. So the child will be parked somewhere else while we can both earn that money. So we do, I think, our current value system is out of whack. Another important area that's out of whack is this whole business of the I don't like the term the rights of women, but the inequality with which we are accustomed to thinking of women. A kind of arbitrary male dominance. Perhaps one of the most pernicious aspects of that in relation to what we're talking about is that the father decides that there will be 3 children, whether or not the wife wants to have them. That's fading, I think, now, but there are many ways in which women are penalized. And I think when they get a much more genuinely equal role in society, that problems that result now because of those inequalities will melt away. So there are problems in our society, but I think the biggest problem is like the problem of pollution 30 years ago. It existed, but it didn't exist in the consciousness of people's minds. When I was a kid, we used to swim in the Humber River near Toronto. Then it got 15 or 16, it got too stinky. Garbage or industrial pollutants. It just got that way, and we stopped swimming there. The whole family used to swim there. And nobody was saying, oh my goodness, isn't this terrible? The notion of pollution wasn't in public consciousness. And that's one of the things that gives me real sort of hope that the contemporary attitudes towards child care, infant care, can change, because the level of consciousness in society about pollution changed in my lifetime. In 15 or 20 years, you can't pluck a grade 7 or 8 kid off the street anywhere in Canada who hasn't heard of pollution. And maybe, and I think it is possible, in 5 years, you won't be able to pluck a grade 5 or 6 or 7 kid off the street who doesn't know that it's awfully important what happens to a child during pregnancy and the first 3 years.
We have so little preparation for that. As I look back, and I'm sure you can reflect the same, having particularly that first child is something that you come to terribly ill-prepared, regardless of your background in terms of education or societal background or economic background. There just isn't anything that you've ever done that prepares you very well for the day you bring that first child home. Is that an area where there's room for hope?
Sure, I think so. There's not much humor in this whole business of, but someone once said that you should be allowed to throw the first one away because you learn so much with the first child. No, it does point up the problem. The problem is that you do learn after 1 or 2 children the amount of work that's involved in it. You may then learn when problems occur later in that child's life that you weren't around enough early on. And then you may wish, that the knowledge you had then was in the kids who are going to have kids